Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session on More Than a Manuscript, Unearthing the Peer Review Process and Other Mysteries of Publications. This program is part of the Student and Early Career Conference, so thank you for joining. As part of today's session, it's an open discussion with two editors that are part of the AGU publications, and I encourage you to feel free to ask your own questions, and you can either do that by typing it in the chat or come off mute. So before we begin, I'll allow our panelists to introduce themselves. So first we have Maureen Long.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. I'm really excited for this discussion. My name is Maureen Long. I am at Yale University. I'm a seismologist, so my own science is focused on understanding the structure and dynamics of the Earth's mantle using seismic waves. And I'm an editor for the AGU journal G Cubed, Geochemistry, Geophysics, Geosystems. I've been an editor of the journal for about 3 years now. And before that, I was an associate editor for JGR Solid Earth.
Thanks, Maureen. Ari, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
Hi, I'm Hari Rajaram. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. I've only been here for 2 years. Before that, for 25 years, I was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. That's where I did pretty much all my faculty career until I moved here. At AGU, I've been an editor in the past for water resources research, and currently I'm the editor-in-chief of geophysical research letters. And I am my areas of research straddle subsurface hydrology and cryospheric sciences.
Great. Thanks, Ari. So I thought to get us started off, I'd ask each of our panelists to share with us one myth or false perception about the peer review process.
Yeah, so the myth or false perception that I kind of settled on for this is the myth that that peer review is this like awful, horrible ordeal, and that like there's always a review or two out there who just can't wait to like get you and you know say bad things about your paper. I think it's a myth that peer review is this like awful thing, right? When peer review works the way it's supposed to, and as editors, our job is to hopefully make it work the way it's supposed to. But when peer review works the way it's intended, it really makes all of our science better. You know, I had my first author paper come out about 15 years ago, so I've been doing this for a while, and I can say that every single paper I've written is better because of the peer review comments than it would have been otherwise. So embrace peer review as a way of making your science better.
Okay, I have a slightly opposite viewpoint with encouragement at the end, and that is that it is a myth that the peer review process is completely objective. You will find that you sometimes get comments from reviewers that are self-serving or whatever you might, it's hard to ascribe motives. But the best thing to do is to not ascribe motives, because at journals like AGU journals, which are part of a professional society in particular, you can always count on the editorial process to provide the checks and balances. And as a young scientist, you should not get discouraged if you get a peer review that makes you not want to get up the next morning. And I can say it happened to me. My papers from my PhD thesis, actually, they were so badly trashed, and I know the intrigue behind all of that now. My advisor was a big shot with a lot of rivals, but I survived. So I just want to say, chin up, and don't get discouraged, because humans are humans, and I think if you're doing the right thing, talk to the right people, and polite appealing with editors and polite responses to review comments, even if they are not objective. When you respond politely and firmly, things always work out.
Great. I'd like to open it up to the floor to our participants. Are there any questions from attendees?
Wants
We'll
to break the ice first?
What should you do if an editor completely ignores your comments?
You mean an editor or you mean a reviewer? You mean as a reviewer or as an author?
As an editor, as a reviewer yourself, so you've contributed your peer review commentary and the editor does not pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Honestly, it happens occasionally that, I mean, normally when we get, let's say we get 3 reasonably consistent reviews on a manuscript, which happens, often from time to time, it happens quite often. We typically ask the authors to respond to all the review comments. And a point may come in the review process when you have to make a decision whether to move forward or not. And once you've made a decision to move forward, you decide that, well, some of these comments they have merit to them, but they can be addressed in the framework of a future paper, right? And that's again another thing that, when I started out my career as an early career scientist, I was so idealistic and I didn't often write. I mean, I had trouble writing papers because I wanted to write everything about a particular topic in one paper, right? It doesn't quite happen that way. I think both ways, I think as a reviewer, being a little generous in understanding that there can be an endpoint to a paper that leaves its analysis of a problem somewhat incomplete for future papers to pick up on. And as an author also, you can put less pressure on yourself to get everything done in a single paper. You're just beginning your career. There'll be lots of papers to write.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'll just add that, I mean, as you've alluded to here, Hari, that, yeah, as editors, we do sometimes get differing opinions on a paper, and the peer review process is designed and set up so that, reviewers have a chance to have their say, the authors have a chance to respond, make their response to the comments. Sometimes there's then a second round of review, and at the end of the day, the editors, it's the editor's responsibility to weigh all of these comments and make a decision. So yeah, that's certainly the role that we take as editors.
Yeah, and as a reviewer, if you feel that if your comments have not been given enough, consideration, I think it's okay to write a polite letter to an editor. It's happened to me from time to time, and I, in such cases, have explained to the reviewer why I made the decision that I did. Sometimes they're okay with it. The other times, some people are upset to the point where they'll say they're not going to review for you again. It happens.
Will the editor review the manuscript themselves, or does it just depend? Is it solely dependent on what the combination of reviewers have recommended?
That's a good question. I think the answer is it depends. As editor, I mean, I certainly read every paper that I handle, thoroughly. I don't provide my own review of every paper that I handle. That would that would be extremely time consuming. But certainly in cases, I read a manuscript and make a decision about whether or not to send it out to review. Usually the answer is yes. And then, send it out. In cases where I get 2 reviews back that have differing opinions or that have suggestions that are, that are not the same or that contrast with each other, then often I will basically do my own review of the paper. And then, I'm basically weighing in on the substance of the reviews. Hari, I don't know what your process is.
I mean, at GRL, again, the manuscript load is very high. The papers that I handle myself, I usually, read the abstract and go through the figures to get a sense for the paper. And then I do a deep dive if the reviews are, in disagreement, as Maureen just pointed out. But if the reviews are in agreement, and I can, from looking at the figures and the general internalizing of the paper I've done, I don't see any reason to, question the reviewers. I will usually go along with them. But there are times when I have to do a deep dive, for example, when the authors kind of object to a review, and it's clear that you have to look into it in more detail to provide a resolution. I guess there are many more questions in the chat, right?
Yes, yes. So keep the questions coming, folks. Why does an editor ask us to select the reviewers when we submit a manuscript? How is this information used? Are they going to be in the reviewer committee?
Those are just review suggestions. They're not. We're not obligated to accept the suggestions that you make, but there are times when those suggestions are very helpful because my own rule is that when I'm doing 3 reviews, I do one that's suggested by the author, and then I do 2 of my own. But if I have trouble finding reviewers on my own, then I'll go further into the list that was provided by the author. And again, here, when we provide guidance to authors in terms of how to suggest reviewers, make sure you suggest reviewers without a conflict of interest or somebody who's, obviously too close to you, things like that.
I agree. And I'll just add that, I mean, it can be very useful as an editor to have a list of suggestions, especially if I'm handling a paper that's a little bit outside my own expertise, which absolutely happens. It's certainly helpful to have a list of people to start from, but typically, yeah, just as Hari said, editors will maybe choose 1 reviewer off that list and then choose, and 1 or 2 other reviewers that aren't on that list. One thing that I've learned in my years as editor is that it's often the case that critical reviews come from reviewers that were on the suggested reviewer list of the, at the time of submission. So I think, we often, as we're thinking of potential reviewers for our own papers, we might have an idea of a set of people who they're gonna see this paper and they're gonna love it. But often these people that we would suggest for our own work end up being fairly critical.
Yeah, there you go. That's another myth, that the reviewers you suggest will be kinder to the paper.
Absolutely. That's
That's pretty funny. As an editor, can you describe your ideal review? What information helps you most to make a decision?
What a great question. Yeah, so to me, a review that is certainly constructive in tone and professional in tone, but critical in a constructive way, and also fairly detailed and specific. Those are the reviews that are most helpful to me as an editor, and I think most helpful to authors as well. It's sometimes frustrating when you get a review that's very negative about a paper but doesn't really provide specifics about what should be changed or what made the reviewer evaluate the paper negatively. This paper is not very well organized. That's not as helpful as, I suggest that the authors move this part of section 2.1 to section 1.3 and rearrange, so the more specific, that doesn't mean that a review needs to be 11 pages long, but and enough specifics to give me as an editor a sense for why you said what you said, and also gives the author enough to work with so that they can make changes. Those are the ones that are really helpful.
Yeah, and also it helps if a reviewer starts their review by a couple of paragraphs that give a kind of view of the whole field, where the paper falls within the current status of the field, and sort of a big a broad rationale for their decision before delving into the specific details.
Great. Sometimes when a paper is rejected for a particular journal, an editor might recommend to submit to a different journal. Are these types of recommendations genuine, or is it a polite way to reject the manuscript?
At AGU, it's often genuine. I would not take the trouble of doing a transfer to one of the other AGU journals without uh, checking with the editor of that other journal and making sure that uh, it's consistent with their scope. It happens a lot with GRL, because first there's the immediacy and the high impact filter that we put on. And the second is that sometimes you look at a paper and you realize that, hey, this is a very detail oriented paper and there's just not enough in the main body, but the main body plus the supplementary together would be a good JGR paper, for example, right? So in cases like that, when we do transfers, they are definitely genuine.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's fairly common, I'll see papers that get submitted to G-Cubed, which is it's aimed at a very general audience, and it's not the place for highly specialized technical work, that, I can read it and maybe it's in my field and I say, this is a good paper. This is going to be a fine contribution to the literature. G-Cubed is not the home for it, right? And so we do make suggestions about other publication venues, that are definitely genuine.
There was one question that I think Sarah has been answering. Let me also just chime in on that to Janak, which is that nowadays there's also the opportunity to submit your paper on ESOR, which is certainly a record that you have submitted the paper, and it provides some level of protection to the author.
Yeah, so the question was, how secure is it to give all the research tools, for example, reusable codes, to reviewers when an author is not sure if their paper will even be worthy of publication? Any hints on what to do in such situations?
Yeah, that can be a tricky one. The standard for making codes or data sets or whatever it is available to reviewers and then ultimately to readers once a paper is published, is basically following the AGU data policy. And the underlying principle is that, a reviewer should have all of the information that they need to be able to assess the science, right? So, it's and exactly the extent to which you need to share, say, your codes, I think that is very highly dependent on the paper and what the science is, right? So I don't think there are hard and fast rules, but you definitely, we do as scientists have an obligation to make sure that other scientists can assess and reproduce the work that we're submitting for publication. So that's the rule of thumb. There is, I suppose, a certain amount of trust at the review stage. There always is, right? When we ask somebody to review a manuscript, we're asking them to keep that paper in confidence and not to share it and not to use it. So there always is a level of trust. But I think the guiding philosophy should be that the reviewer should have everything they need to assess the science.
I think Nicole was frozen, so I'm just gonna step in to continue the Q&A part because I couldn't see her face moving on the screen.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's great. And the other question that I see in the chat is that what happens if authors would like to make changes, such as fixing errors without affecting results right after paper has been accepted?
Typically, they have to get approval from the editor if it is more than just like minor typos and things like that, or typesetting issues. And there has to be a good reason for it. If it's a minor thing and it's not changing the results, usually the editors would approve it. And it does happen from time to time that the proofs will show that equations were not properly typeset or figures got a little bit messed up, and you certainly have an opportunity to fix those at the proof stage. And I even recently had one strange instance where an author contacted me saying that, we had gone through about 6 or 7 months ago this whole issue that their proof was not in good shape, and Wiley Production, AGE Production was going to fix it, but then it showed it's still not fixed in the online proof. So but they finally did, take care of it last week.
Okay, Maureen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think what Hari said is exactly right. I mean, it does require permission of the editor to change anything substantive after acceptance, but if it's something, you can always check with the editor, right? If say, oh, I accidentally uploaded the wrong version of Figure 7 and here it is with, better line widths or something. I mean, I think most editors would okay that and it's no big deal. So just check with the editor.
And I've had, I also had one other odd instance recently where an author who is, I really applaud this author for his honesty, that he told me that the people from whom he got the experimental data that he based his work on found some problems with their measurements, and the error bars on their measurements was significantly larger than what they thought. And because of that, he felt it was right to update his paper by changing the figures to show the updated error bars. And there was a minor change in the conclusions because of that. I mean, one of the conclusions could not be as strong as it was in the original paper. And in a case like that, this, for example, that was actually in Solid Earth. So, but we got a couple of the Solid Earth editors to look at the issue, and collectively we agreed that it was okay to allow that change. And they actually updated a paper that was published, 7 or 8 months ago in the online system.
Great. I think the GOAT policy is to always in communication with the editor if you need to make any changes to the manuscript. And okay, next question that we had is from Ramsey that is it too soon after your manuscript have been rejected, then immediately submit to another journal?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, if your manuscript gets rejected, submitting to another journal is a good next step. I would certainly say that it's never a good idea when you've gotten, constructive feedback from reviewers and your paper has been rejected, to turn around and submit it to another journal without making any changes or taking into account the constructive feedback that you've gotten in review. For most of us, our subfields are small, and if somebody got asked to review your paper for journal number 1, there's a decent chance that one of those reviewers is going to get asked to review the next submission at a different journal. So, yes, of course, you should absolutely turn your paper around and submit it somewhere else. That's great. That's what you should do. But I would always encourage everyone to pay attention to at least the constructive and good faith review comments that you get before you submit it elsewhere.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with that. And, in the first part of your question, you say multiple journals at once. No, that's a no-no.
Oh yeah, I didn't see the question in the chat. Yeah. One journal at a time for sure. Usually when you're, I forget exactly how it's phrased in the AGU submission system, but you're asked to affirm that you're not submitting the same work to multiple journals at once. So, yeah.
Thanks. I think we got a question that Sarah has recommended. That I have a question regarding supplemental information. Most journals say these are not thoroughly peer reviewed. Do the reviewers and editors don't look at these documents?
I would not agree with that entirely. I think that most of the time the reviewers do look at the supplementary information.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's part of the paper, and reviewers should be evaluating that. It's true that it's not supplementary information is not, of course, typeset. So there's not a quality control step that the journal is doing in looking for typos and that sort of stuff. So in that sense, the quality control is a little looser, but reviewers absolutely should be looking at it.
There was an earlier question about somebody was asking if they how to get themselves into the review database. This is from Alireza Meriki. Ideally, what you want to do, of course, you're welcome to write to the editors of journals saying that you're interested in reviewing, editors in AEs, especially close to your specialty. And it's also fine to ask your advisor or senior colleagues that if there is a manuscript that they get to review, which they don't have time to review, that they're welcome to suggest you as a reviewer. That's how typically young researchers get into the review process, when somebody is unable to do a review because of time constraints and suggest them.
I endorse that strategy. Yep.
I'll pass back to Nicole now.
Yes, the internet strikes again. What are some factors to consider when selecting a journal?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, this is, I think one of the most important questions that authors should ask themselves with each paper, right? How do I decide where I want to send this? And yeah, to me, the most important question to ask yourself is who do you want to read it, right? Who's your intended audience? Who do you want to see it? And to choose a journal, that's one of the factors that go into choosing a journal. Is your paper, very broad interest and aimed at a wide audience of geoscientists? In that case, you want to go to a journal, like GRL, that's very broad. Is it more technical and this is really aimed at people in your subfield, then you want to go to something that's more specialized. So I think you always want to think about who's the audience for your work, and then ask yourself that question when you're deciding on a journal.
Yeah, and the other one more thing to keep in mind is that there is also a tendency among some AGU journals to be more fundamental, compared to all the journals in the same subfield. An example is if you take hydrology, there's a lot of applied operational hydrology, so to speak, like flood forecasting as a method, as an operational task, as opposed to trying to understand how hydrologic systems behave in order to better understand how floods may be generated. AGU's water resources research, for example, has a reputation of being focused on the more fundamental science side and less on the operational side. So when you make decisions about journals to pick, that also is a factor. Some journals tend to be more accepting of applied papers. In hydrology, for example, Journal of Hydrology is much more open-minded about applied papers than water resources research is. So that's also a factor to consider. And often, when you put that kind of thought into a paper ahead of time, I think it will help you out. I'm, for example, in a position now with one of my PhD students that we worked on something where at the end, after all that hard work, the simulator that we were using was really not up to the task of the question that we were trying to address in a wholesome way. And so we had to kind of pare it down, make a lot of simplifications, and come to the point where, yeah, we can tell a story, a reasonable story, but it's not as, we know that it's probably not going to be in the highest level journal in the field. So we make, you humbly make that decision.
And that's okay. I mean, that kind of science is a contribution, right? Another factor, of course, is as you sit down to think about writing something, just is what kind of format is going to help you tell the story. I think some work and some results are very well suited to a short format journal, right? And others, you could sit down and say, I need, this is a JGR sized story and not a GRL sized story, say, just to take two examples. So, I mean, I think there's certainly work that, when you sit down and think about writing it up, you say, okay, this is not something that's going to be well served by a short format journal. And I think sometimes people try to shoehorn work into a short format that really sometimes maybe would be better served by a longer paper.
Considering the volume of submissions that come across your desk as editors, how do you decide whether to send a submitted paper out for review or do a desk rejection?
Yeah, that's a big issue at GRL, for example.
I bet Hari does more desk rejections than I do. Yes.
I would do more desk rejections, and I guess sometimes a desk rejection is really serving the authors well, in the sense that we're saving you a month in the peer review process at GRL, because it takes about a month to get the JRL reviews done. But if I send it back to you saying that, hey, you know what, you could turn this into a good JGR paper, and that's probably better for this paper, you get the decision in a couple of days. So I know, and honestly, many of the reject without reviews that we do are basically papers that are not of good quality, that are not going to pass muster in any AGU journal. Sorry to say that, but that's also a reason. I don't think that I don't think we try to do rejects without review needlessly. Let me put it that way. It's not like we are making a choice. Should I send it to review or should I desk reject based on any other factor other than the prospects of that paper in the peer review process?
I don't have much to add to that. That was yeah, that was perfect.
Okay. If a co-author shared the core materials and methods of an unpublished paper, for example, a computational field, at a large conference like AGU, some audience later on published a paper with the exact key concept applied to the same data set, how do you recommend handling submitting your own manuscript? Should you mention this information to the editor upon submission?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of a tricky one. I guess in this hypothetical, yeah, so it's basically work where an early version of it had been shared at a conference, and then, maybe another group scooped you. Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's certainly appropriate to cite and discuss other relevant work. I mean, that I think is always appropriate. I mean, I guess my own view is that there is, of course, a lot of value in a study that, maybe has a similar philosophy or even a similar underlying data set as another study, but is maybe tackling something in a slightly different way. I mean, I guess I would never say to an author, well, we're not going to publish this because there's another, similar work that just came out. I mean, it might change the way you pitch your story a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think you always find your own, you tell the story of your study and not the study that somebody else did. So yeah, I guess that would be my advice. Hari, I don't know if you have another.
Yeah, I would add a little more in a way that, especially in this day and age when there's a lot of data-driven studies that happen, there are a lot of research groups that have a whole bunch of workflow established within their within their research operation, where they can chug through a new analysis relatively quickly. And in a climate like that, I hate to say this, but I think the safe thing for any young researcher to do is that if you are going to present material or your co-authors are going to present material at a conference, try to make sure the paper is submitted soon after. It's just a good practice. I think it's happened to a lot of us in our younger days. Especially data-heavy stuff, where the algorithms are all standard. Somebody finds this new data set and they run it through. Remote sensing is one, it's a topic where this happens a lot. I know senior researchers in that field who basically tell their students that, hey, if you're going to submit something to a conference, the paper should be ready within a month of that, or you're exposing yourself, right? So I think that's fair advice. So I would say, from your own side, to avoid disappointment, try to be disciplined about getting the paper submitted soon after it's presented in the conference.
Great. How big are the differences or how much effort goes into a review for a big journal where you pay significantly higher fees versus doing a review for a lower impact journal? Does high impact correspond to better or more detailed reviews?
I would say not necessarily. um, yeah, I would say not necessarily. I mean, I think there's, there's variation in the quality of peer review. I mean, I know I started off by sort of being a booster for the concept of peer review, and I am, and I firmly believe that, peer review makes our science better. But I also agree with every point that Hari made in his introduction, right? And there are variations. Reviewers, some do a great, really thorough job, and every once in a while you get somebody who mails it in, right? Or who is, unprofessional, or, sends you something that's ad hominem and is not constructive, whatever. So, and I don't think that there's that much of a correlation between, the impact factor or the famousness of the journal necessarily and the reviews you'll get. I mean, I think a careful editor can help an author, hopefully make the best of the reviews that they get, and suggest, help make suggestions in cases where reviews are not clear or not helpful. But yeah, I guess that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that, I like to think that especially early in your career, you should bring the same thoughtfulness and thoroughness to a review that you do for any journal. And the time may come in your career when you feel that, I'm not going to accept to do reviews from this journal anymore because of the quality of work that gets published there. And, early in my career, I even had instances where you get resubmission of a revised paper that really did not improve a whole lot, but the editor is kind of saying that, I need to move this, I need to move this. And at that point, what do you say? My review comments were not addressed, right? So then you just say, well, okay, maybe I'm not going to review for the journal anymore. And that is, and of course, nowadays I don't do any reviews because I have to deal with about 35 manuscripts a day. But in the time when I was doing reviews, I did come to a point where there were certain journals for which I just would not review.
Knowing how important they are, how closely are references and citations scrutinized?
They are scrutinized, quite significantly, especially by the reviewers. And most of the time, it's fair and balanced. There are times when you will find a reviewer who, going back to the first myth that I told you about, you will find reviewers that say that, hey, there's all these problems with this paper, but they can all be addressed if you cite all these papers, A, B, C, and D, and guess who authored those papers, right? It happens. I'm sad to say that in one instance, I even had, when I was an editor, I had an associate editor that did that routinely on many of the papers that they handled. And I really put my foot down and in my decision letters and said, you don't have to take those, you're not obligated to take those suggestions.
Yeah, I agree that does sometimes occasionally happen. And I think Hari's right that a good editor should be able to see that and say to the author, yeah, you don't need to necessarily cite all those papers. But I mean, it is, one of the things that you're looking for when you do a peer review is this work situated in the context of the rest of the literature and previous results properly. I mean, that's one of the things that, that's one of the criteria for a good paper, right? So it's appropriate that reviewers look at what's cited and what's left out.
Yeah, and one more, and there is another side to it, which is really kind of odd, that I do know of some senior authors that will refuse to cite work from a particular other group, even if it is something that should be cited. And there again, the editors, we do our part. And one of the things you learn as an editor is how to coax and nudge.
I agree with that.
Does publishing a multitude of low quality papers, and this person means papers in which you repeat previous papers' themes with small changes, or the papers in which one doesn't have a strong story to tell, affect one's career? So this is a very big picture question.
I think sometimes people get taken less seriously if they do that too much. I particularly know, I've had instances of authors who were coming up for tenure, uh, and it was almost becoming predictable that, I send a decision on one paper, 2 days later I get the next one in the sequence. And it was getting to the point where, the review, you exhaust reviewers first, right? I mean, the topic is kind of a niche topic. There's a small number of reviewers who can review it. It gets to a point where it's almost, ridiculous, right? At that point, this person is losing their credibility, and that's what will happen if you get too incremental. That being said, if you have papers that, for example, didn't make it in one journal, there's no shame in turning it around, taking the review comments seriously, revising the paper, and getting it accepted in a different journal.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's not always easy to make a call with your own science about how, okay, I have this result or this study. How do I parse this out? Is this one enormous paper? Is it 2 papers? Is it 3 papers? I mean, that's not always a super straightforward call to make. But I agree completely with what Hari said about, I think it does. I think it does hurt you if you're putting out a bunch of truly low quality. Nobody's going to be impressed by a bunch of truly low quality papers on your CV. That's not going to impress anybody. People do read, people will read your stuff, and if you're pumping out large numbers of lousy papers, no one's going to be impressed.
Yeah, though, let me, I can probably elaborate on the nature of the incrementalism that I witnessed in that one instance, where the same data set, first paper was method A, second paper was method B, then method C, then method D, and then the 5th paper was comparison of methods A, B, C, D. Right? So yeah.
If the material is better served by writing a more meaningful, larger single paper, then I would always say go that route.
And there are people who write what I call as template papers. They have a template of a manuscript ready, and then they can take anything new and chug it through the template. Their papers all look very similar. And after a while, it gets old, right? And it may be that you end up having a lot of manuscripts. As somebody once told me that this is also a myth, actually. There's a strange kind of myth also about papers, which is that, the really bad papers get rejected. Any sort of paper that's a significant advance that generates some level of controversy in the community, also, it eventually likely get accepted, but it goes through some troubles. The innocuous papers that are kind of right in the middle, they actually sail through, surprisingly. And there are many people who make their career of writing that kind of middle innocuous type paper. And honestly, I don't have any strong feelings for or against that. Anybody who is working hard and doing their research, they keep academic disciplines moving forward. And I think we all acknowledge humbly that, we never know what work is going to outlive its own generation, right? That's something that will be picked up on in the next generation.
How important is the cover letter in the decision to accept the paper for review?
I can say personally, not very. I mean, I do read the cover letter, but I tend to, I'm more interested in the abstract and the figures as a first cut, as Hari said earlier. So personally, to me, it's not a huge part of my evaluation process, but I suspect this is something that might be different from editor to editor.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cases where the cover letter matters is in the later iterations of a manuscript. If it's, let's say it's gone through 2 iterations already, and this is the 3rd version, and you certainly, you wouldn't want this to become like a never-ending, infinite loop. And at that point, if you write a compelling but polite letter to the editor saying that, we've kind of gone through and addressed comments twice. In this round, we've addressed these comments, but we've chosen not to address these for the following reason. And you're quite clear in justifying that. That type of a cover letter, carries weight. But otherwise, language and things like that don't matter that much. The points you're making in the cover letter, the technical points should be, compelling and politely made. And as I said, these kinds of issues only matter in the later iterations of a manuscript.
What do editors do to filter out aggressive comments? This is particularly important for early career folks, since receiving these hostile reviews can have a very negative impact on them.
Yeah, good question. I mean, there are a couple different tools that an editor has at their disposal. We can redact comments in cases where there are comments that are truly unprofessional, ad hominem, not constructive at all. We can redact reviews. I think it's pretty rare that I felt the need to do that. But another thing that editors can do is give our own opinion. I mean, when I'm writing a response or a decision letter, I fairly often will, if there's a comment in a review that I disagreed with or thought was out of line, I'll mention that in my decision letter. So editors certainly can say, reviewer number 2, most of the review was helpful, but this thing, they said I don't agree with that, or that was out of line. You can disregard that comment. Editors, certainly we have those tools at our disposal.
Yeah, I totally agree with Maureen on that. And one more thing I would add is that there are instances when I ask a reviewer if they would care to replace their review file with a more politely worded version, and often they agree to do that. I mean, especially when you tell them, hey, this is, look at the impact it might have on this young person at the other end, right? And sometimes they do follow up and agree to tone things down.
As a reviewer, is it okay to skip parts of the paper that are not in your area of expertise, and mentioning that you have not reviewed this section, for instance, certain methodologies or things clearly outside of your scientific comfort zone?
I mean, I think it's helpful if there are parts of the paper where you'd feel like you do not have the expertise to, really have an informed opinion about the science or that part, I think it's helpful to indicate that to the editor, to say, this part is is a little outside of my wheelhouse, so I don't, I'm not equipped to comment on that part. I'd still encourage you to read the whole thing, and because as an outsider or someone who doesn't have expertise in that, you're sort of stepping in as potentially as a reader might, right? There may be readers who want to read this work and maybe they don't have expertise in this specific thing, and it's still useful for a reviewer to see whether, is it clear what they're doing? Does this make sense, even if you don't understand the technical details? So I would encourage reviewers to still read and engage with everything, but it can be helpful to indicate to the editor what you do and don't have expertise in.
Yeah, and I think it's very helpful to the editors on multiple fronts. The other is that when I get a couple of reviewers that say that, well, this is a broad paper and the parts that I was comfortable reviewing are these, which are in my area of expertise, and I feel that I cannot make a decision with the reviews that I got, then I know what's missing in terms of expertise. And it gives me hints on if I need to bring in a third reviewer, what expertise should I be looking for? And it's a fair thing to do. If there are parts of the paper you're not comfortable with, as a reviewer, it's a good thing to point out that you're not able to give opinion on those parts of the paper because that's a little bit outside your area of expertise.
Regarding the review system, do you see any advantage regarding implicit bias if journals switch to a double-blind review system? And for folks out there, you may also want to go ahead and define what double-blind means.
Okay, my understanding of double-blind is that the author's names are not revealed in the manuscript. In other words, the reviewer does not know who the author is, and the author does not know who the reviewer is, both ways, right? That's what I think double-blind means. This is a hard one, mainly because, I think unfortunately, in many instances, it's not difficult to guess who the author is or which research group they're from. And people do that all the time, even in a lot of double-blind systems. But that being said, I totally, agree with the merits of a double-blind peer review system. I'm not sure how easy it is to implement, and maybe Randy has a viewpoint on that, but I do agree with the merits of a double-blind review process. And, and I'll tell you, and again, I hate to be cynical on some of these things, but I do have instances where a low-quality paper submitted from a elite institution actually gets a pass, sometimes needlessly so. And I've made some, let me say, enemies by trying to be fair in ensuring that they don't get a pass. And that's the kind of place where the double blind would actually come in handy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I somehow suspect that might be more common than the other way. I think it's probably more common that a lousy paper coming from a high profile group gets through rather than a great paper gets rejected because it doesn't have a glitzy institution. I suspect that the first one is maybe more common. And I agree with what Hari said. I think in theory, double blind makes a lot of sense. And I suspect in practice that there would be, maybe the majority of the time reviewers would be able to make a pretty educated guess about the author or the group that it's coming from. But it might be something that we as a community, double blind review is not common in the geosciences. So it may be something that we as a community or in the AGU journals can experiment with.
Yeah, and that being said, I also don't want to diminish the issue of implicit bias. There is definitely implicit bias in the process that is, it's not there for the most part, but I think if you looked hard enough, you would find instances for sure. So it's not something that we should diminish the importance of. And honestly, I don't know the double blind will fix the issue, but it certainly is one step in the right direction.
There's a question from Maggie, who was going back to our earlier discussion about being scooped. And they have mentioned that the question about the unpublished study being scooped is not hypothetical. I spent my time on finishing my master thesis rather than getting the manuscript out. But after my master's thesis was completed, a paper which applied my new concept with exactly the same detailed settings on the exact same data set appeared. I still want to submit my own manuscript, but am struggling whether I should mention to the editor.
Well, I feel for you, I would suggest talking to your advisor and figuring out a strategy of how to deal with it. Sometimes there's just not much that we can do as editors in a situation like this. If the work that was done is too similar to yours, unfortunately, it got ahead. There may be other ways of addressing these types of issues that don't have to do with editorial or AGU publications. If there's some other kind of misconduct involved, that's another way to pursue it. When we have instances like this within AGU, for example, there are instances where a paper might be submitted which draws upon material that's in a thesis that is on, what is that? I forget the name of that database that has all the theses, UMI or something like that. Certainly the cross-check features in AGU would catch it. And if not, there have been instances where what cross-check didn't catch, a reviewer caught. And in cases like that, AGU has a process for addressing this kind of misconduct.
Well, we are almost at the top of the hour. So as part of our wrap up, I've asked the panelists to think about one final piece of advice that they would give a student or their younger selves about how to successfully navigate the peer review process.
Yeah, well, Alice, first, thanks so much for the super thoughtful questions. This was really fun. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of advice, and I think you've heard both myself and Hari say versions of this over the last hour. When in doubt, you can always ask the editor. Like editor, we are here as as a resource for authors, right? If you get reviews back and you're like, oh, reviewer 1 is telling me to do this, and reviewer 2 is telling me don't do that, do this, and I'm struggling to reconcile these conflicting reviews or whatever, rather than stewing about it and kind of like bang your head against the wall, ask the editor. I mean, the editor, that's, the editor's job is to give advice and to, if you're trying to navigate a tricky situation with reviews, or I got this review comment and I don't know what to make of it, ask the editor. It's fine to reach out and ask if you're finding something confusing in navigating the peer review process for your paper.
Yeah, I totally agree with Maureen on that, especially if there are conflicting reviews and you feel you can't address all of them. It's fine before you submit the revised manuscript to write an email to the editor saying, this is what I plan to do. Would that be okay? And, from my side, what else I can add to that? Don't take the review process personally, I think, and I speak this from experience. In my as I mentioned, very early in my career, I had some major setbacks in the peer review process that hurt me, for years after that. I didn't outgrow them for some years. And in hindsight, I think that one should just kind of be stoic about some of these things. Recognize that people are people. You can deal with things objectively. I think in instances when I felt that I had papers that were not reviewed fairly, just kind of, hunkering down, responding to every review comment thoroughly, in detail, objectively, politely, things just work out fine in the end.
Thanks, Hari, for ending us on a very positive, positive note. And I want to thank all of the attendees for helping contribute to a very dynamic session with your questions. I hope you have found this session very informative. You'll see in the chat that there are some different resources that we've pulled together that can help you navigate through the peer review process. And I want to thank Hari and Maureen for donating some time to share their insights with us, as well as Sarah and Randy from AGU Publications, who have been super helpful on the chat. So thank you all once again for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of the fall meeting.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you all for attending. It's fun to talk to you guys.
Yep, thanks, everybody. And thanks, Nicole, for moderating.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Sarah and Randy and
putting this together. Yeah.
Johan.
And Johan for filling in for me.
Yeah.